to visit Swansea 2 years ago for a big data conference. It did a little bit, but it was a beautiful time. I wish I'd known you then because I would have knocked on your door. So Amy's research interests in breastfeeding really began out of your experience with breastfeeding yourself, and so wants to talk about positioning breastfeeding within a broader social context. And so I will hand it over to you at that point.
Thank you. Yeah, in Swansea we have rain, whereas you seem to have snow here. We just have continual rain. Something like, I think we've got the record for the most rain in the entire UK. So yeah, it's beautiful, really. So I came to this back when, 14 years ago now. I'm a psychologist by background. Did a psychology degree and did extremely little about infant nutrition whatsoever. There was nothing there. I remember one lecture where we were told that breast and formula milk were pretty much equal unless it was for prem babies. That was the only evidence there apparently was about the impact of breastfeeding or breast milk. So I had no clue. I'd signed up, managed to get funding to do a PhD in something completely different to do with eating behaviour in older children, and managed to get into about a week of that when I realised I was pregnant with my first baby. And the experience of that completely changed everything, because I realised that one lecture we'd had about donor milk for prem babies being the only important thing about infant feeding, and the psychology of infant feeding, the psychology of motherhood was completely missing from my entire degree. So I just completely changed the entire subject of that PhD and started looking at this issue of pretty much this, does that change? There we go. Of this graph. Now, I've put together this graph from some data from the Lancet series 3 years ago now, but it was pretty much the same back then. And despite intentions, particularly in the UK, being really quite high to breastfeed, we've got the lowest breastfeeding rates in the entire world. Somehow, even with having pretty good fertility leave policies now, we've got far lower breastfeeding rates than in the US. And compared to most regions around the world, we are really, really falling down, and particularly on exclusivity. I was asked to go to New Zealand recently, and they said to me, it's dreadful, we've only got a 15 to 20% exclusivity rate at 6 months. And I said, no, like, what do you expect me to do about it? But there really is an issue. Now, as a psychologist, what interests me is what's going on. This can't be something physiological. It can't be that for some reason British breasts aren't working. They're working really well in Norway. It's got to be something to do with the context that they're in. So as a psychologist, now working in public health, what my research asks is, well, what's going on here, and how can we actually have public health level solutions to try to fix it? The second point as a psychologist, and what I'm really going to talk a lot about, is that this graph doesn't represent intention and kind of satisfaction at duration. I think the latest stats in the UK measure that 90% of women who stop in the first 6 weeks didn't want to do so. And that has a huge impact on their mental health. And as a psychologist, that's where I'm coming from, and I'm right in the middle of it all. And talking about social media earlier, you only have to spend some time in my social media life to see that there is a huge backlash and a huge generation really of women who have been let down, and that's what we really need to change. So in terms of going through these questions, what is the one thing related to the research you're super excited about? I am an academic. I do research into the issues that women are having around breastfeeding. I don't tend to do trials. I don't tend to do big, large-scale kind of care studies. I do research talking with women. So I sat down and tried to calculate the other day how many women that I've talked to, not directly, but through questionnaires, asking them to take part in this research, and we're up to about 35,000 women trying to encourage women to see that the barriers are around them. When they haven't been able to breastfeed, it's very rarely their fault as such. It's usually the fault of the wider system around them. And what I'm trying to do at the moment is work with women to help them understand that and see if we can change that. Because if they stopped blaming themselves, if they stopped blaming each other, and they could really see that it's a system that's usually at fault, I think we've come a very long way. So we've been doing lots of different things to try and get this message across. We have a series of animations out there where we take our research studies and we turn them into animations for the public. There's 5 up there now, and we're making some more. If you Google, not now because everyone will start playing the music from YouTube, this is always what happens when I say Google, YouTube Amy Brown breastfeeding, you will find the series of animations, just have a look through. We've got on social media about 17 million views of these in about a year and a half. They are phenomenally used, they're being used everywhere. Because the messages are just so simple. So we take just really, really simple stuff around obvious things like, it's normal for babies to wake up at night. That one's got about 7 million views. You think that, it's something really, really simple. But actually people don't know that and they think that formula's going to solve it. So we just talk about normal baby behaviour and try to communicate that. They're being used in lots of hospital boards, lots of places around the world now. Second thing is actually talking to mums, blogging, writing for the conversation. I'm going to get their niche now in a certain box. Public science writing, but in a very, very simple way. Now, the HuffPost articles have had thousands and thousands of views. For the Conversation UK, which if you're not aware of it, is kind of an academic newspaper as such, where we write topics for the public around our research. I think up to about 800,000 reads on there. It's writing articles that really get out to the public and tell them about the research in a simple way. We've got popular science writing books, and you'd be surprised just how well they go down with the public in terms of actually turning the research into something that's readable and you can really access them. And the work that Natalie and I have been doing with Tiny Humans, who are really taking the science of human milk and the components of it and scarves and clothing and everything to actually get the message out there in a really simple way. So it's talking to the public about what's in human milk. And this is something that I think I mentioned in another slide, but it wasn't until I met Natalie, and I calculated it's now been 3 years or something, which seems like forever, that I didn't have a clue about anything to do with human milk. I was kind of taught that even as I got a PhD, as I kind of went through publishing all these papers about breastfeeding, I had these kind of simple messages in my head that breast milk's best for babies, and I could probably tell you something about antibodies. And that was literally about it. Now, if I, as a kind of well-published academic in breastfeeding, cannot tell you really about what's in human milk, and I still can't really tell you, Natalie does it very simply for me every now and again, it reminds me. But if I don't know that, then how on earth is the average mother out there meant to know what power she has in her body to feed her baby? So we really, really onto something here in actually communicating human milk science to the public, because we don't know it. We don't know it apart from these really, really simple messages. And we do know that the formula companies do it extremely well. So they tell you a very, very simple bit that they've put in some formula, they communicate it even though it's really simplified compared to breast milk. And everybody goes, wow, that formula is amazing, because we're not doing it for breast milk. So publicising breast milk is a big part of what we're doing. The next big breakthrough, I was saying to Natalie this morning, we talk far too much on a day-to-day basis about changing the world, but the next breakthrough really for me is going to be this. So the concept of breastfeeding and breast milk being normal, valued and supported, particularly in the UK context where we completely have a formula feeding culture, that that 1% of mums that we have who exclusively breastfeed for 6 months, formula is so normal. And what we've all been working to do is to try and just make it normal, to increase knowledge of it, increase acceptance of it. And there are a number of ways where I really think we are changing, that we're moving forward. 2 almost comical ones is that recently, if you know anything about the UK gutter press, we have The Sun there, The Sun newspaper. our university press office sent me an email the other day going, Amy, you're in the sun. What's going on? Turns out they published the piece that I'd written on 10 things new mums worry about when breastfeeding and how to tackle them. So the Sun published a really important piece on breastfeeding. Same with the Daily Mail. Another kind of focal game. The Daily Mail's published something and I'm going, oh no, what now? But here, this was their headline that they wrote, why new mothers should not be scared to breastfeed. So really, all these ideas talking to mothers like it's completely normal. So for the UK press to be printing things like this, it is a phenomenal change over the years. I don't know what slides. We have, we're making huge progress in the UK, at least with big organisations who are taking lots of money in formula funding. So the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health, under a lot of pressure, has just announced that it's going to at least look into suspending its agreements with formula companies. The British Journal of Midwifery, and this is slightly private for now, so please don't put it outside this room. I had an email just this morning because they've inundated with formula sponsorship, all their awards. I've had an email this morning asking to talk to them. Can they bring me and actually talk? Someone from the board wants a conversation about how they can possibly stop this. And there's lots of examples going forward, so I really think we're getting somewhere. The way we've been doing this is social media. This is an article that Anthony and I wrote. I can't remember how many shares, was it something like 5,000 shares from more than that in 24 hours in the HuffPost. The main thing for this is that I don't think we've got any negative backlash for it. We wrote an article saying that donor milk could be the first choice for more babies, and nobody yelled at us. Now for social media, and for my experience on social media, that's phenomenal given how much it got shared. So what we're doing with social media is taking all this research, having a big conversation about it, positively going forward. The barriers. This is a slide for some research that I've been doing. I've been doing it for 3 years now. You can see in every conversation that goes on online, that goes on probably in many places offline, around breastfeeding and formula feeding, is this idea of supposed two camps. The idea that formula feeders and breastfeeders and they're attacking each other, and the idea that breastfeeding promotion makes mums who don't breastfeed feel guilty. There is so much hurt out there, and it's concentrated, it's targeted, it's directed in trying to get people to stop talking about breastfeeding. When you get to the bottom of it, it's because women are hurt. We know that when people get angry, a lot of that anger is from hurt. And we know it's an issue because we spend so much time then fighting it. So not only is it an issue for the women who feel this way because they haven't been able to breastfeed, it's an issue for anyone trying to support breastfeeding going forward because they spend a lot of their time getting attacked online. So I did some research, actually sent them as well, okay, if you weren't able to breastfeed your baby as long as you wanted, tell me about how you felt. And I put this online, it was qualitative, it was open boxes, it was about 10 boxes, I got 3,000 responses in a week. So this was 3 years ago. So I've literally been reading through every single story. It's the same thing that comes out time and time again. And if you see the breadth of those emotions, it's not just that they feel a bit upset that they weren't able to formula feed. They feel devastated, they feel traumatized. They really, the strength of it. And then what happens is that they take all of these emotions and they blame themselves. We have a culture generally that gets women to blame themselves for things rather than having better services for them. Women's healthcare, particularly if you're not a middle-class educated white woman, your healthcare options you're not invested in. The amount, always give the example, many times more is invested in erectile dysfunction research compared to any female hormonal issue. We just don't get the same investment. And things like this, women are encouraged to fight with each other, to form these two camps, to blame each other for, oh, you're making me feel guilty, you're telling me to breastfeed, when actually we need to get them to blame the system. If we can get women to actually realise that they've been let down, so realise these services were not in place, realise there's industry promotion that's trying to persuade them not to breastfeed, realise it's generationally there, so their mothers didn't breastfeed and then they're passing on this hurt, this guilt, losing the support. If we can actually get them to see that and change it, then we're going to make a big difference. And a part of that, I really believe, is talking about human health and what's in it. And as I say, 2 years ago, lead with statements. So we gave them statements like the difference between the nutritional content of breast and infant formula milk is too little to matter, and only a third disagreed with that. So most of the public are going, yeah, it doesn't really matter what's in breast or vomit, it's pretty much the same. Long term, it doesn't really matter if a baby is fed with breast or formula milk, only 29% disagreed with that. Giving a baby infant formula increases their risk of illness, only 18% agreed that it did. We really have no understanding about the difference in content at all. If we think that as academics we need to do more, well, we really need to do more about getting the very simple messages out. The second related point is that this isn't just general personal trait. It's people in positions of power. People in positions of power in funding companies, funding organisations for research. Just some examples of comments I've had back on grants where I've wanted to get funding for projects around supporting women to breastfeed. I don't understand why you're doing this research. I formula fed my baby and he's fine. You're too evangelical about breastfeeding was another one from an organisation that's meant to be about public communication in academia. And another one, you need to do more research to support women who formula feed too. If you're getting that from that level of reviewer of academic grants, it shows the lack of knowledge, but it also shows this circle how to move forward. And really that's something I'm asking everybody, because if I give the solution to this, we can make some change. One thing we are doing to make change is having that conversation, and I really believe we're going forward and we're moving things and things are getting better because we're getting more backlash on Twitter. This is my usual kind of measure of how well I'm doing, is how quickly people attack me on the internet. And it's at an all-time high, so I'm taking it from that we're doing really, really well.
Next we have Bridget Young, who's coming to us from the University of Rochester down in New York, and she studies human milk and its impact on pancreatic function, among other things.
Hi everybody, well I'm just so thrilled to be here today. I feel so honored to have been invited. Amy, you set me up beautifully for my talk. So I have taken a little bit of liberty and changed my title a tiny bit to be engaging with diverse stakeholders in human milk research to better serve the modern mothers and infants, because at the heart of what we do, that's what we're trying to do. Our research is to serve and benefit them. So I'm going to suggest what I view as the top barriers and research priorities moving forward in the context of 3 overarching challenges, which you see here. And I'm coming to you kind of wearing 2 very different hats today. One, I am I would say, human milk composition researcher. I have an NIH-funded lab at the University of Rochester, and we're very interested in how maternal phenotypes, specifically obesity and diabetes, impacts breast milk composition and programming effects on the early neonate. But I also have a personal passion project website and YouTube channel entitled, prepare yourself, Baby Formula Expert, where I do my very best to translate what infant nutrition research we do have about infant formula into practical messages for parents who are in the position of needing to feed formula so they make nutrition-based decisions as opposed to market-driven decisions. So I'll be sharing with you some of my insights from working with families with formula tolerance issues and from the website in general. And it's very important to point out that this is a US website, so my experiences with families from the US, a country where we do not have paid maternity leave, and we notably do not adhere to the WHO code of marketing in a big way. So our first overarching challenge that I want to cover is that we're dealing with a changing population. I mean a changing maternal population. Everyone in this room is no stranger to the data that the prevalence of overweight and obesity is on the rise in women of childbearing age and breastfeeding mothers, and that is not just in the US, although this data is from the US. In addition, concurrent with that, we have a large and acute increase in the prevalence of insulin resistance and diabetes, and our understanding of the impact of those on breast milk has not nearly kept up with the pace at which these prevalences are rising. This is a graph from one of our cohorts showing the tight correlation between human milk insulin and maternal breast milk insulin. It's also similar for other markers of maternal insulin sensitivity, and it's much stronger than the correlation with just maternal BMI. What I want to draw your attention to are the differences in the axes that despite other hormones in breast milk like adiponectin and leptin, we see high concentrations, or at least similar concentrations of insulin in breast milk compared to maternal circulation, where something like leptin is 100 times lower in breast milk. So this represents a pretty clinically relevant exposure to the recipient neonate. And on that line, this is from a cohort we currently have ongoing of type 2 diabetic breastfeeding women. And when we take those women and we match them with normal glycemic and gestational diabetic women matched by both their pre- and postpartum BMI and infant sex, we can see that the insulin concentrations in their milk is still significantly higher, indicating that this elevation is likely to be driven by their disease state and not by an elevated BMI. With the change in maternal population, we see what we would expect to see in donor milk composition. This is a study of 128 donor milk pools. All these samples were pooled from multiple women, and we see this huge range in insulin concentrations in both raw and post-pasteurization pools. And I want to point out to you the high concentration for the pasteurized pool is still 40 microunits per mil, which I would argue may be a concentration high enough that an infant being breastfed by a normal glycemic lean mother may never experience. And so now we're dealing with a potential mismatch, an evolutionary mismatch in providing milk from another mother to a potential recipient infant. So considering that we have a changing population, moving forward in the field, a significant priority I see is to continue seeking to understand how changing maternal phenotypes, in my interest as an example, how that affects both human milk composition, and I didn't talk about production, but that's equally as important. And then, of course, how those changes affect infant outcomes. And to me, this is kind of the definition of the very buzzed term of personalized medicine, being able to provide individualized recommendations and healthcare based on individual mother and infant characteristics. So moving along to our second overarching challenge is that we're dealing with rapidly changing feeding practices. And I think everyone in this room is aware of that, and I want to draw your attention to specific circumstances. This is an article by Dr. Rasmussen's group that actually is several years old, but beautifully encompasses it. Trends in breastfeeding, not at the breast anymore. The modern American woman rarely is an exclusive nurser at the breast. In this study, 100% of the cohort of women interviewed fed their babies expressed milk, so pumped their milk and fed it to their babies. 25% of the mothers continued to feed expressed milk after pumping had ceased. So we're dealing with, again, a mismatch in the timing of expression and intake. And I would go ahead and say that I think that number is higher now, that pumping is almost absolutely universal, and we have this universal mismatch in expression versus feeding. I actually, jokingly but seriously, refer to us now as, in the US, we have the breastfeeding triad. It is the mom and the baby, but it is also the freezer stash. And that freezer stash causes equal anxiety in the mom, than also just feeding the baby, but most likely driven by the fact that the vast majority of US mothers face returning to work at some point while they are hoping to continue breastfeeding. In the US and worldwide, this is another continuing trend. Exclusive pumping is a rapidly growing group. So these are women who never nurse at the breast, and I would say the vast majority of them, that was not their initial choice, that for latch issues is the number one expressed reason. They end up exclusively pumping and feeding their baby their breast milk in a bottle. And that, while this is kind of funny, I want to draw your attention to the circled numbers, that these are support groups online for exclusively pumping mothers, and these groups are actively growing, and it's becoming a large way to embrace exclusive breastfeeding that, you know, we don't have a lot of medical literature to support. Additionally, we have done a great job in lactation communicating the message that breast is best, and that has created a large demand for donor milk when mother's own milk is unavailable. In the US, we do not have anywhere near the supply to meet that demand, which has led to a large increase in informal milk sharing. This is a data from a recent national survey showing that 94% of mothers interviewed had heard of informal milk sharing, 12% admitted to providing their milk to another baby, and most of that exchange occurred between acquaintances. But we know that the demand is so high that there has led to an increase in exchange with money involved. This is breast milk that's on sale on Craigslist right now. You can just go to your city and look, and you can go and buy breast milk from a woman who has some in her freezer. And all social media outlets have support groups like this to facilitate the monetary monetary exchange between donors and recipient infants. Obviously, we wish this exchange was happening within the realm of a pasteurized donor milk bank for both mother and infant safety, but it speaks to the unmet need. And lastly, a lot of parents are feeding. We could all recreate this graph in our sleep, and we've done a great job. Exclusivity is increasing, initiation is increasing, but the inverse of this graph, before 6 months, if those babies are breastfed, they are receiving infant formula. So by 6 months, roughly 75% of U.S. infants will have received a feed of formula, and obviously a lot of them will have received a large volume of infant formula. So from my work with parents who are faced with the decision to feed formula, the overwhelming message that I receive from them is that they feel both desperate and abandoned. So desperate because no parent arrives to the decision to feed formula lightly, and we've heard a lot about this today. And abandoned because when they get to that place, we don't have good evidence-based recommendations in place to help them make the decision about which product to choose, and also the mechanics of how to go about introducing it, especially in the context of mixed feeding. So I would identify those as priorities for future research, to be able to provide parents with unbiased, evidence-based infant formula guidance regarding formulation, and also practical feeding guidance, being able to translate our lactation research into messages that women can incorporate into their very complex feeding decisions, not simply assuming that exclusive breastfeeding is exclusive nursing. The last overarching challenge is that mothers themselves are changing, and they're different now than they were 10 years ago in how they want to interact with and receive their medical care and their medical information. This diagram, this elegant diagram, represents how I used to think about the biggest challenge that I consider as myself as a medical researcher. So I'm a researcher, I do an awesome study, I have some great messages. I have a really hard time communicating it to the practitioner so that they can get it out to the public. As a side note, Dr. Rasmussen taught me in graduate school how to make theoretical diagrams, so I hope this doesn't horribly embarrass you. So with that in mind, I used to perseverate about this. How do we communicate this to the midwives, lactation consultants, the doctors? Meanwhile, infant feeding is happening all by itself in a totally separate realm outside of our silos of academia. Infant feeding is not just a decision a mom makes when she's pregnant. It is a decision that's made feed after feed, day after day, and it's a constantly changing, complex decision. And while this is a beautiful picture showing peer support that is so important to women, this is more what modern motherhood looks like. That especially in the US, motherhood can be very isolating, and women are turning to online support systems out of necessity. And we know for a fact that digital and social media drive a large number of feeding decisions. A study in 2014, which is generations ago in terms of online growth, identified that the generational gap between our healthcare structure and patient preferences led to an increase in smartphone usage to fill knowledge gaps. These are medical knowledge gaps. And that in 2016, 50% of pregnant women interviewed self-identified as online information seekers. And the conclusion from this paper from the authors is that we really need more quote-unquote millennial-friendly, accurate medical information sources to fill this hole that women are filling elsewhere. This is a study that, a qualitative study asking pregnant women what they're looking for when they turn to online sources for medical information. And I've highlighted the aspects that I can personally concur with, but that also I think are eligible for us to fill. So they want customized, practical, that word practical again, unbiased, and of course professional information. And this is another study from Dr. Rasmussen's group showing this exact theme in the context of lactation, that mothers are actively turning to social media to inform their pumping practices, storage of human milk, how to feed express milk to their baby, and a lot of the themes and questions identified in that research. I would feel much more comfortable if those women were turning to practitioners for that guidance, because they have implications for both infant and maternal health. And so again, infant feeding is happening without us if we can't get more involved. This is a similar study of just women in general, not specifically pregnant women, that further identified that women themselves are seeking selective engagement, or I would say community, and unfortunately unfortunately now looking to challenge medical authority when they move to online sources. A quote from that paper read, "The need for reassurance and frustration and anger," which I saw on your slides, "with deficient healthcare services contributed to these capacities." Some of this we know intuitively just from the number of support groups online that women are looking for community. There's a lot of resources for breastfeeding women. I think there can be more, but we see groups popping up all the time to support mixed and formula feeding parents, and that's a gap that they can't find from their medical practitioner. This is an example of frustration in response to advice received from a pediatrician that I did not think was that bad. And I would highlight my sort of favorite from this. Number 485, why no one should ever take any food or nutrition advice from a pediatrician. Well, I would really hope that, and this was an infant feeding question, that your pediatrician would be the first person you would turn to for feeding advice. Now, it's amazing to have this group assembled. We're not going to change an entire culture in one day, but we can take steps. And the reason why it's important to recognize this culture is this feeling of abandonment and mistrust or fear of judgment leads to closet behaviors. And by closet behaviors, I mean feeding practices that patients actively hide from their practitioner. These are all examples of feeding behaviors that mothers have, I'll use the word, confessed to me that they are doing with their infant, that they are actively lying to their pediatrician about. You can look at this list. Some of them are more benign than others. Some of them are pretty great. Breastfeeding beyond 24 months. Why did she feel she couldn't tell her pediatrician that? Some of them are quite alarming, but the fact that they felt they couldn't have transparency with their practitioner, even if it was against what the practitioner recommended, clearly puts an infant at potential risk. So to summarize, the barriers and research priorities that I identified are as follows: that women want an understanding community, they're seeking it elsewhere, but we have the opportunity to provide understanding and compassion to them, which will increase their transparency. And that they're very frustrated with the lack of infant feeding support, which we've heard echoed already today. Research priorities to me moving forward are to provide unbiased, evidence-based infant formula guidance so that they can make nutrition-based decisions, practical feeding guidance that they can incorporate into the complex way that we're feeding our infants today, and all of that fits under the umbrella of personalized medicine. So meeting an individual mother and individual infant where they are and helping them move forward. I don't want this to be a doomsday talk. I actually think it's an amazing time to be involved in research, particularly lactation research, because we have the opportunity to engage directly with mothers. So we have to, I will propose, move beyond the traditional method of disseminating research and accept that we are literally all in this together now, directly communicating with patients, which allows us to receive their insight, but also drive our research questions. And lastly, this is my last slide, if we're going to be thinking about infant feeding stakeholders as a whole, these are the other pieces that are already entrenched in infant feeding. So engaging with frontline healthcare providers, which I think the research community does a great job. Involving mother's milk substitute manufacturers. By this, I mean both non-for-profit and profit donor human milk banks, and also formula manufacturers who are putting products onto the market. Breast milk substitute regulatory agencies, and my hope would be that we would be able to provide more regulation in terms of what marketing messages are allowed to be used, and also to inform formula formulation. And then of course lactation and infant feeding product industry, which rapidly is increasing the complexity of our modern feeding. So with that, I would like to thank all of you, both my funders and my research group, and also the brave mothers who share their stories with me. Thank you.
So I'm Shelley McGuire, I'm at the University of Idaho. I don't know if any of you guys can answer this, or if this is more of a question for the audience, but so in the United States we have, let me back up. This question has to do with how can we get science-based information out to the public the best way possible. There's a lot of answers to that, but in the United States we have this thing called extension, which is part of the land grant system, and there's these extension armies, I call it. Extension educators, they're in every county, we've got specialists, we have people out there doing nutrition, and it's been my experience that nobody does breastfeeding education. And I'm wondering if it's a hugely untapped resource that at least we have in the United States. And my question, I guess, for everybody is, do you know of any extension units that actually take this on? Because it's
We're already pumping millions of dollars into extension education.
No, I don't. Short answer. I don't know of anybody doing any.
What an untapped opportunity, right?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, so the way it works, the way it works in New York at least, is that it's an interaction between the land-grant university and the counties, and the counties prioritize what they want. And Cornell, in this case, tries to deliver it. And so I think there would need to be some education at the county level done to get them to make the demand that the universities could then respond to. However, that should not keep us from being proactive and using the research resources and the public fora we have from working with the counties. I mean, it basically has to start with us, to go to them, to create the demand, to give the stuff back to everyone. It's pretty much a circle.
I'm gonna run the mic, but I have a question first. So, great talks, everyone. I had chills. I don't know, it's a little chilly in here, but I think, if the speakers in the room today, and I know I have a biased opinion being in this field, but if I had the chance to see any one of you speak, I would be super excited to have you all in the room at once. It's amazing. So my questions are on knowledge translation, which you all have touched on. And one thing I struggle with when I'm presenting my research is the data are the data, but you can frame it, and I don't use the word spin because that has a bad connotation, but you can frame it in different ways. And so do you use breastfeeding as the norm and then talk about what happens when you formula feed? And usually that's a bad consequence, and then does that guilt the moms who formula feed? But we should frame breastfeeding as normal because it's the baseline. Or do you do it the other way and frame it as compared to formula, there's all these benefits to breastfeeding and try and be more positive? So I'd love your thoughts on that. And I'll see who else has questions. Just a small question.
You know what? Are we going?
Yep.
Maybe
Yeah.
that big.
So, for me, I center communities of color in all of my work, and I find that things like guilt, shame around not breastfeeding tends to be what I call a phenomenon of upper middle class white women. Okay? This is not something, I do not see Native women who don't eat their, don't breastfeed, completely distraught over not doing it. It's kind of like, oh, another thing that was really hard and didn't work out, and now I'm going to move on because I have all this other stuff to do. It's not to say it doesn't exist, it does, but as a whole, that is not the audience that I'm focused on because I don't see it across the community. So I talk pretty bluntly about breastfeeding. I mean, I do talk about it as life and death in some cases. I talk about it very bluntly, and definitely try and normalize it and more talk about risks of not breastfeeding. But it's hard, and I will say I'm a therapist, right? And so I believe in being honest with people, and I also, on Thursdays I open up my home, and I've hosted a breastfeeding drop-in group for 6 years. And I have moms in South Seattle, which is the community that I serve clinically, which is one of the most diverse zip codes in the United States. Thanks to gentrification, we're now number 3. We used to be number 1. But, with those moms, I'm going to have a really diverse group of women that come to that. And as a therapist, I'm going to speak to them and where they're at, right? And so one of the things I take great pride in is my counseling skills as a lactation consultant, and so I'm not going to just kind of like, well, you don't, breastfeed your baby's going to die, because we know that's not true, that's not the case, but when I'm talking about Native babies dying at 3 to 5 times the rate of SIDS of white babies, right, I'm going to talk pretty bluntly about the importance of breastfeeding with that, okay, and so it is going to change based on the audience for me, but in general, when centering communities of color, that's like protecting feelings is not a huge priority of mine. So, yeah.
I can add just a really quick, we probably our context. I struggle a lot with the idea of public health messaging versus patient-to-patient counseling. It's really hard to, when you're dealing with, again, this idea of personalized medicine, you have an individual mother and baby in front of you, counseling them with public health messages. So I can offer what I do, and I'm not saying it's the best. Instead of spinning breast has benefits or is the baseline, I try to talk about breast milk as the original personalized medicine to a mother. You make breast milk for your baby, your antibodies, your HMOs, your shared genes. That's wonderful for them in whatever quantity you provide for them. If that baby needs additional calories for whatever reason, let's use standard nutrition practices to choose a formula that we think is going to meet that baby's individual biology. Not all of us thrive on the same diet, and so different ingredients. That's why we have so many formulas, and the marketing around them is terrible, but that's why there's so many. So trying to use similar messaging to use nutrition to help advise formula, and try to use the individualized medicine approach to personalize that breastfeeding relationship and the milk a mother makes for her baby in an individual context. And then public health messaging, I think what we're doing with breast is best. I mean, you can't not say it. It has to, you have to say it. But again, using compassion to underline all your interactions goes a really long way.
I think just if we've got time to add something, do you need? It's really, really complicated, but I do a lot of this talking, and I think it's matching really your message to the community that you're talking to. So one thing about the comparisons, you say breastfeeding is, or you say formula increases risk. We're trying to make sure that we don't actually compare. So when you talk about what's in breast milk, you don't have to say more than in formula. You can just talk about breast milk, because sometimes if you then say, start talking about formula, people take it as an immediate kind of tackle them, that you're criticising them. The second thing is to talk about what's normal. The phrase I hate most in the world is breast is best, because it's not best, it's normal. And best doesn't help anybody, because we don't do what is best in our lives. Number of alcoholic drinks I had on several planes last night. I did it anyway. There was a warning on the bottle not to drink too much, but it doesn't work. But talking about what's normal when it comes to babies is a really just important message. So breastfeeding comes under that. But more generally in supporting women to breastfeed, we've got this local kind of education class in just outside Swansea called Hello Baby. And rather than talking about breastfeeding to the parents, it's in very deprived communities, they talk about normal baby behaviour. So they talk about responsive parenting. They talk about normal baby needs. They talk about normal sleep. They talk about how often babies feed. And by doing that and not talking about breastfeeding, because breastfeeding immediately kind of makes people curl in the ball, they've raised their breastfeeding rates, because they taught parents about what is normal and what is expected. And that's a lot of what we try to do. We don't try and go on about breastfeeding. We talk about it. Babies, it's normal for them to wake at night. It's normal for them to feed frequently. So it's thinking about the non-confrontational ways to do it in communities that feel confronted, which is the internet.
Okay, so thank you very much for another wonderful panel. In my view, the three of you combined really represent the best of the best, and what really means to do evidence-informed advocacy in the breastfeeding field. And our extensive systematic reviews of the literature have shown that nothing has ever happened in any country with regards to successful scaling up of breastfeeding protection, promotion, and support without people like you. So what you represent is an extremely important and powerful dimension of implementation science when it comes to translating knowledge into practices and really moving beyond the breast is best statement. The question that I have for you is that many of us as researchers, and Amy will identify with me on this as an academician, you're a top-notch academician in a very prestigious institution in the UK. we were trained as, your role is to do science, is not to do advocacy. You should leave that to others. You have to be neutral, you have to be impartial. What is your answer to that in the 21st century? How do we deal with that way of thinking? What is our role as scientists when it comes to evidence?
You are completely right. I get told, I have the criticism usually from, not to generalise, but academics who've been around a very long time. They tell me you should be spending all those time doing trials. You should not have an opinion at all on how they should be fed. I think things are changing. I think the more I do what I do, I'm very lucky with my university. They've recognised it fully how well it is making a difference. And I think talking to others about public engagement, showing them how to do it, mentoring them in that, all my PhD students, they get taught about talking to the public. They wouldn't get away with not doing it. You write and your message is there. And if you have public funds in any way, if that's research money, if that's money from students through fees or whatever, you have the duty to turn your knowledge into something